In a small town nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, there was an old, whispered tale, the forest of Cap and Shadow. No one dared to enter, not since the story of the Bentleys, a family that disappeared within its depths decades ago. Hunters, hikers, even scientists avoided the forest. Yet its pull was magnetic to the curious and for some, irresistible. Elle had always been fascinated by the unknown. She wasn't superstitious, and her love for fungi made the rumors about the forest of Cap and Shadow tantalizing. People claimed that strange mushrooms grew there, larger than any in the surrounding areas, some glowing faintly even during the day. Elle, a budding mycologist, couldn't resist. Equipped with her field notebook, a camera, and a foraging knife, she decided to explore what others feared. As she approached the forest edge, the air felt cooler, heavier. The tree trunks were wrapped in vines, their bark dark and damp. Mushrooms clustered around their bases, their caps stretching wide like open hands. The faint scent of earth and rot filled the air. She had barely taken a dozen steps before she noticed how quiet it was. No bird song, no rustle of leaves, only the faint sound of her own footsteps. She felt her heart rate quicken but brushed it off. It was just a forest after all. The first mushrooms she encountered were ordinary enough, rust-colored caps with white stems. She jotted some notes and took a photo. But as she ventured deeper, the mushrooms became increasingly strange. A cluster of deep violet fungi emitted a soft glow, almost imperceptible in the dim light. Elle bent down to examine them. When she brushed one with her glove, she felt an odd resistance, like the mushroom was pushing back. She yanked her hand away. Deeper into the woods, the mushrooms grew taller and denser, some reaching up to her waist, their caps patterned with spirals and stripes that seemed to ripple when she stared too long. Elle couldn't deny that something felt unnatural. Yet she couldn't bring herself to leave. Her fascination was stronger than her fear. She found a massive mushroom with a golden cap and a thick, gnarled stem. Its base was surrounded by smaller mushrooms, all swaying gently as though caught in a breeze, but the air was completely still. That was when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound almost like breathing. Elle froze, scanning her surroundings. The sound was coming from beneath the golden mushroom. Slowly she knelt to peer under the cap. There, nestled between the gills, was a cluster of tiny, pale shapes. At first she thought they were insects, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized they weren't insects at all. They were small, human-like figures, each no bigger than her fingernail. They were staring at her. Her breath caught in her throat as the tiny figures began to move, climbing down the stem of the mushroom. Their movements were jerky but purposeful. Elle scrambled back, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she whispered, half hoping it was all a trick of her imagination. The tiny figures didn't respond. Instead, they continued their descent until they reached the forest floor. They stood there in a loose circle, still staring at her with eyeless faces. She reached for her camera with trembling hands and snapped a photo. The flash startled them. They recoiled, then scattered into the underbrush, vanishing as quickly as they'd appeared. Elle let out a shaky laugh, trying to convince herself she'd imagined it. But the image on her camera screen told her otherwise. The light in the forest began to change, dimming unnaturally fast. She glanced at her watch, barely midday, yet it felt like dusk. The air grew colder, and the mushrooms around her seemed to lean inward as though they were watching. That was when she noticed the spores. They drifted through the air like fine dust, shimmering faintly. Elle tried to wave them away, but they stuck to her skin, her clothes. Breathing became harder, and she felt an odd warmth spreading through her chest. Panic set in. She turned to leave, but the path she'd taken was gone, swallowed by the forest. The trees loomed closer, their trunks wrapped in a patchwork of fungal growths. Her head grew fuzzy, her vision swimming. She stumbled, catching herself on a tree. The bark felt wet and warm, almost pulsing beneath her hand. A voice, soft, distant, whispered her name. Elle, it repeated, the sound coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. She turned, searching for the source, but saw only the forest. Then from the shadows, shapes emerged. Tall, spindly figures with mushroom caps for heads and elongated limbs that bent unnaturally. Their faces were smooth, featureless, except for dark, hollow indentations where eyes should have been. Elle backed away, her breath hitching. The figures moved closer, their movements synchronized, their steps silent. "Join us," the voice whispered again, though none of the figures moved their mouths. She shook her head, stumbling further into the woods. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, spongy, and as she looked down she realized why. It wasn't dirt she was standing on, it was a vast network of fungal growth, stretching as far as she could see. The figures followed, unhurried but relentless. Elle's vision blurred as the spores thickened, coating everything in a shimmering haze. She felt a strange warmth in her limbs, as though the forest was pulling her in, claiming her. Her legs gave out and she fell to her knees. The golden-capped mushroom loomed ahead, its glow pulsating rhythmically. She crawled toward it, drawn by a force she couldn't resist. As she reached the base, the tiny human-like figures reappeared, emerging from beneath the mushroom's cap. They swarmed around her, their eyeless faces tilted upward as though examining her. Elle tried to scream but no sound came. The warmth in her chest spread, rooting her in place. Her skin prickled, and she realized with mounting horror that something was growing from her arms, tiny white threads breaking through the surface. The figures began to climb her, their touch cold and alien. The golden mushroom pulsed brighter, and the voice whispered once more, "Welcome home." When Elle's friends reported her missing, a search party ventured into the forest. They found no trace of her, only her camera, lying beneath a massive golden-capped mushroom. The photos on the camera were blurred and strange, images of towering fungal figures and tiny pale shapes, almost human. No one returned to the forest after that. But locals swore they could hear whispers on the wind at night, soft and persistent, calling a name they dared not repeat. When James Mercer was sentenced to 5 years in Black Ridge Correctional Facility, he thought his life couldn't get any worse. Known as the Bone Cage by the inmates, the prison had a reputation for being one of the most brutal in the state. But its brutal reputation wasn't what unnerved James the most. It was the stories about Cell Block C. "You don't want to end up in C," a grizzled inmate named Red warned him during his first week. "People go in there but not all of them come out." James laughed it off. "Yeah, sure. What? Is it haunted?" Red didn't laugh. Instead, he lowered his voice, glancing over his shoulder as if the walls themselves were listening. "Let's just say, you don't want to know what they're keeping in there." Cell Block C had been abandoned for years, ever since a mysterious riot resulted in the deaths of 23 inmates and 3 guards. Officially, it was closed for renovations, but James quickly learned that no one was working on it. He overheard whispers from the other inmates, shadows moving where they shouldn't, voices calling out late at night, and the faint sound of chains dragging across the floor. James had no intention of finding out if the stories were true, but fate had other plans. It happened during his second year when he got caught in a brawl in the cafeteria. He'd barely thrown a punch before the guards tackled him to the floor and hauled him to solitary. But solitary wasn't available that day. "We're taking him to C," a guard grunted. "What? No. I'll behave." James protested, struggling against their grip. But the guards didn't care. He was dragged down a long, dimly lit corridor toward the infamous cell block. The air grew colder as they approached. The fluorescent lights flickered, and an eerie hum filled the silence. The heavy iron doors of cell block C groaned as they swung open, revealing a dark, empty hallway lined with rows of rusted cells. "Enjoy your stay," one of the guards sneered, shoving him into the first cell on the left. The door slammed shut with a deafening clang. James immediately felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. There were no inmates here, no guards patrolling, just him and the cold, oppressive air. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally in cell block C. The only sounds were the occasional drip of water and the distant creak of metal. James tried to sleep, but the cot was hard and his nerves wouldn't let him rest. And then the whisper started. At first he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. Faint, unintelligible murmurs echoed down the corridor, too soft to make out but just loud enough to set his nerves on edge. "Hello? James called out, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped. For a moment, all was silent again. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. Who's there? James pressed himself against the back wall of the cell, his heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside his cell. In the dim light, he could just make out a shadow, a tall, hulking figure standing motionless in the hallway. "Let me out," James begged. "I shouldn't be here." The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it slowly turned and vanished down the corridor. The next day, or what James assumed was the next day, he noticed something etched into the wall of his cell. It hadn't been there before. "Leave while you still can." James felt a chill run down his spine. The scratches were deep, as if whoever carved them had done so with desperate force. He tried to ignore it, but that night, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, clearer. "Help me, help." James covered his ears, but the whispers only grew louder, surrounding him, seeping into his very bones. "Help us." When he couldn't take it anymore, he screamed, "What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural laugh that echoed through the cell block. The next morning, James noticed another message carved into the wall. "It's hungry." He tried shouting for the guards, banging on the bars until his fists were raw, but no one came. The prison seemed deserted, as if he were the only one left. Desperation turned to terror when night fell. The footsteps returned, but this time they weren't slow or deliberate. They were frantic, chaotic, accompanied by the sound of chains rattling. Shadows darted past his cell, too fast to be human. And then he saw it. At the far end of the corridor, a figure emerged. It was tall and emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Its face was a twisted amalgamation of features, human yet grotesquely wrong. It moved toward him with jerky, uneven strides, dragging chains behind it. James backed into the corner of his cell, trembling. "Stay away." The creature stopped just outside his bars, its head tilting unnaturally. And then it spoke, its voice a deep, bone-chilling rasp. "You can't leave." For the next week, James was tormented relentlessly. The creature appeared every night, sometimes whispering his name, sometimes clawing at the bars of his cell. Each morning, new messages appeared on the walls, written in a substance that looked disturbingly like blood. "Wants you. Running is futile. Join us." James grew weaker, his mind fraying at the edges. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, his every thought consumed by the terror of the night. On what he assumed was the 11th night, the creature finally entered his cell. "No," James whimpered, too weak to move. "Please?" The creature crouched over him, its foul breath filling his nostrils. Its glowing eyes bore into his soul. And then everything went black. When the guards finally opened cell block C a week later, they found the cell empty. There was no sign of James Mercer, no blood, no body, only a single message scrawled across the wall. "It's never full." They locked the doors and left the cell block undisturbed, but the whispers continued, growing louder with each passing night. And every now and then, a prisoner would swear they saw a figure lurking in the shadows, its glowing eyes watching, waiting for the next soul to claim. Emily had always dreamed of exploring Rome. She was a freelance journalist, traveling the world to uncover hidden gems and unspoken histories. Rome's vibrant streets, rich with culture and stories of the past, seemed the perfect destination. But when she received an invitation to join a secret tour of the Catacombs di San Sebastiano, a restricted portion not open to the public, she couldn't resist. The invitation was hand-delivered to her hotel, sealed in a thick envelope. Inside the letter read, "Miss Emily Hayes, your work has intrigued us, and we believe you would appreciate the stories beneath our city's foundation. Should you accept, meet us at the Trastevere Clock Tower at midnight. Bring a candle." Curiosity outweighed caution. That night, Emily made her way to the clock tower, a bundle of nerves bundled beneath her thick coat. The streets were quiet, the usual hustle of tourists replaced by an eerie stillness. She arrived to find a man waiting for her, a tall figure cloaked in black, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice smooth but cold. Emily hesitated before nodding. He handed her a candle, already lit, and motioned for her to follow. They walked through narrow alleys, the man's silence gnawing at Emily's nerves. Soon they reached an unmarked door in an unlit street. The man produced a heavy iron key and unlocked it, revealing a stone staircase descending into darkness. "This is where your story begins," he said before turning and disappearing into the shadows. Emily stepped inside, gripping the candle tightly. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving her heart pounding. The catacombs were cold and damp, the air heavy with the smell of earth and decay. Rows upon rows of ancient stone tombs lined the walls, each marked with faded carvings. The faint sound of dripping water echoed through the tunnels. Emily's candle cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. She began to document everything: the intricate carvings, the layout of the tunnels, the strange symbols etched into the walls, symbols that didn't belong to any known Roman style. As she ventured deeper, she noticed the air growing colder, the silence more oppressive. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the tunnels were alive and listening. That's when she saw it, a small alcove off to the side, its entrance partially obscured by debris. Emily's heart raced as she approached, feeling an inexplicable pull. She cleared the rubble and stepped inside. The room was unlike the rest of the catacombs. Its walls were adorned with frescoes, vivid, grotesque images of people kneeling before shadowy figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. In the center of the room was an altar, and upon it sat an urn, its surface covered in the same strange symbols she'd seen earlier. Emily reached out to touch the urn, but as her fingers grazed the surface, the candle extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. The sound of whispering filled the air, growing louder, surrounding her. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. Then she felt it, a cold, bony hand brushing against her arm. Screaming, Emily bolted from the room, stumbling through the dark until she managed to relight her candle. But when the flame flickered to life, she froze. The tunnels had changed. The narrow passageways were now labyrinthine, stretching in directions she didn't remember. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. The whispers returned, this time forming words. "Leave this place." Emily hurried through the corridors, trying to retrace her steps, but every turn seemed to lead her deeper into the maze. The frescoes grew more disturbing, figures mutilated, consumed by shadowy creatures that seemed to emerge from the very walls. Then she heard footsteps. At first they sounded distant, but they quickly grew louder, faster. Emily turned, her candle flickering wildly. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man draped in tattered robes, his face pale and gaunt, eyes sunken and devoid of life. "You've disturbed the sanctum," he rasped. "You shouldn't have touched the urn." I didn't know," Emily stammered, backing away. The man's expression twisted into a sinister smile. "They're awake now. And they're hungry?" The walls began to pulse, the symbols glowing brighter. Shadows seeped from the cracks, coalescing into monstrous forms with jagged teeth and clawed hands. Emily ran, her screams echoing through the tunnels as the creatures gave chase. She tripped over a broken piece of stone, the candle slipping from her grasp and shattering on the ground. Darkness enveloped her. In the pitch black, she felt them closing in, their breath cold against her skin, their claws raking across her clothes. Desperate, she fumbled for her phone, using its weak light to illuminate her surroundings. The creatures recoiled, hissing, but they didn't retreat. Emily crawled backward until her hands hit something cold and smooth, the urn. Without thinking, she grabbed the urn and hurled it against the wall. It shattered, releasing a blinding light that filled the chamber. The creatures screamed, their forms dissolving into the shadows. When the light faded, the tunnels were silent again. Emily sat trembling, the broken remains of the urn at her feet. But her relief was short-lived. The glowing symbols on the walls began to fade, one by one until only darkness remained. And then she heard it, a deep, resonant voice echoing through the catacombs. "You've set them free." Emily stumbled through the tunnels, her phone's light guiding her. After what felt like hours, she found the staircase leading back to the surface. She burst through the door into the night, gasping for air. The man in the wide-brimmed hat was waiting for her. "You shouldn't have gone inside," he said coldly. "Now they're loose." What were they?" Emily demanded. "The Forgotten Ones," he replied. "Guardians of a power Rome buried long ago. And now you've doomed us all." Before she could respond, the man turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving her alone under the Roman moonlight. Emily left Rome the next day, but the nightmares followed her. She could still hear the whispers, still feel the cold breath of the shadows. And as she sat in her apartment, staring at her unfinished article, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "They're coming." In the culinary world, rumors of the Midnight Chef circulated like ghost stories told around a campfire. He was a whispered legend in fine dining circles, a chef so skilled that his dishes supposedly brought diners to tears. Yet no one had ever seen his face or caught a glimpse of his kitchen. All people knew was his name, Chef Marceau, and his mysterious restaurant that appeared only once a month in an undisclosed location. Danielle, an ambitious young chef, was determined to find him. She worked tirelessly in a popular city bistro, but her culinary passion felt stifled by mediocrity. When she overheard two regular patrons mentioning Chef Marceau's next event, her curiosity turned into obsession. "His restaurant is opening this Saturday at the edge of the old industrial district," one patron murmured over a glass of wine. "Invite only. And the menu? Allegedly otherworldly." Danielle pretended not to listen, but her mind churned with possibilities. She spent the next few days researching Chef Marceau, learning nothing concrete, only layered stories that contradicted one another. One article claimed his cuisine unlocked suppressed memories. Another hinted that patrons never returned to normal life afterward. By sheer determination, Danielle obtained a counterfeit invite through an anonymous online forum. It was handwritten and came with strict instructions. 1. Arrive at the stated address precisely at 11:57 p.m. 2. Do not bring any guests. 3. Do not leave your table before the meal concludes. On the appointed night, Danielle arrived at the location, an unmarked building at the edge of town, cloaked in fog and urban decay. A flickering, handwritten sign outside simply read, "Marceau's Midnight Dining Experience." The interior was dimly lit, with candles casting long shadows across a minimalist space. Only 5 tables were arranged inside, each occupied by silent diners. They sat frozen, their expressions varying from bliss to unease. A gaunt man in a black suit greeted her. "You're late," he said, though her watch read 11:57. "Sorry, Follow me," he interrupted, escorting her to a corner table. He handed her a menu which contained no descriptions, only cryptic titles. Echoes of the Past, The Second Chances, A Quiet Ending. A single waiter approached. "Have you decided?" Danielle hesitated. She pointed to Echoes of the Past. The waiter nodded without a word and disappeared into the shadows. Moments later, a small porcelain dish was placed before her. The dish was exquisitely presented. A single white mushroom atop a dollop of golden puree, drizzled with an earthy reduction. The aroma hit her instantly, warm, familiar, like her grandmother's kitchen. Danielle took a bite and memories crashed over her like a wave. She was 6 years old, sitting at her grandmother's table watching her knead dough for mushroom dumplings. She could hear her laugh, smell her lavender perfume. Tears streamed down her face before she realized she was crying. The waiter took the plate before she could protest. The second course, The Second Chances, arrived in the form of a delicate fish, enrobed in a sauce as dark as the deepest ocean. This time the flavors were rich but unsettling. As the taste unfolded, a surge of regret tightened her chest. Memories of her failed relationship surfaced. The nights she neglected her partner, choosing work over love. The dish seemed to amplify her guilt, whispering that it was too late to fix what had been broken. Danielle pushed the plate away, shaken. Other diners glanced at her with hollow eyes, as if understanding her torment. The final course, a quiet ending, arrived without her ordering it. A small dessert rested on a black plate, a single slice of blood-red cake topped with an edible gold shard. She hesitated. "What's in it?" she asked the waiter. "An ending," he replied. Her hunger vanished, replaced by fear. But something compelled her to take a bite. The sweetness was intoxicating, masking an underlying bitterness. The room began to spin and her body felt weightless. Shadows crept from the edges of her vision, devouring the light. Danielle woke in an empty room, the restaurant now dark and lifeless. Chairs were overturned, tables bare. Her watch read 4 a.m., but she couldn't recall what had happened in the missing hours. The gaunt man in the black suit stood by the door. "Your meal is complete," he said flatly. "What happened to me?" Danielle demanded, her voice trembling. "You were served exactly what you asked for," he replied, motioning to the exit. In the weeks that followed, Danielle returned to her life, but nothing felt the same. Her cooking lacked its former passion, her dishes tasting flat and uninspired. And every time she looked in a mirror, she swore her reflection moved slower than she did. The final straw came when she received a letter in her mailbox. No postage, no return address. Inside was a single sentence, written in elegant script. "Once tasted, there is no forgetting." Danielle spent the rest of her days chasing memories of that night, trying to uncover what had been taken from her. Some nights, she swore she saw the gaunt man watching from the shadows, his presence a reminder that she was part of Marceau's midnight dining experience forever. She had wanted greatness and it had consumed her. Now she was just another ghost story in the culinary world. The small town of Baden, nestled at the edge of the Black Forest, was known for its pristine landscapes, ancient spas, and quaint architecture. Tourists flocked there every year to bask in its old-world charm, unaware of the whispers exchanged among locals in hushed tones. Baden, the outsiders said, was a paradise untouched by time. But the locals knew better. Everyone in Baden had heard the tales of Der Verlorene Keller, or the Lost Cellar. Supposedly hidden beneath one of the town's centuries-old buildings, the cellar was said to contain the remnants of forbidden experiments conducted during the 1800s by a reclusive alchemist named Friedrich Baumer. Most residents dismissed it as a ghost story meant to spook children, but others, those who had heard strange sounds in the quiet of the night, weren't so sure. Sophie Lang, an investigative journalist from Berlin, arrived in Baden on a chilly autumn evening. She had grown up hearing about the town's mysterious cellar, and after years of research she believed she had pinpointed its possible location. The Schwartz Rose Inn, a crumbling building near the forest's edge, was her target. "Are you sure about staying there?" the cab driver asked as they pulled up to the inn. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "It's cheap and it's close to the forest." The cab driver didn't respond immediately, his knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. "Locals avoid that place," he finally muttered. "People say it's cursed." Sophie thanked him for his concern but dismissed the warning. She had a job to do. The inn was as eerie as she had imagined. The once grand facade was marred by ivy and grime. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew. The elderly innkeeper, Frau Meisner, greeted her with a nervous smile. "You're our only guest," Frau Meisner said as she handed Sophie an old-fashioned brass key. "Breakfast is at 8 and please," she hesitated, glancing down the dark hallway. "Stay in your room at night?" Sophie nodded, trying to mask her excitement. She had read accounts of strange occurrences at the Schwartz Rose, from phantom footsteps to unearthly moans. Staying here felt like a step closer to uncovering the cellar's secrets. That night, Sophie lay in bed listening intently. The old building creaked and groaned like a ship in a storm. Around midnight, she heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from beneath her floorboards. Heart pounding, she grabbed her flashlight and followed the noise. The scratching led her to the basement, which Frau Meisner had specifically told her was off-limits. The door was locked, but the aged wood had rotted enough for Sophie to push it open. The basement was colder than the rest of the building, the air heavy with dampness. Her flashlight illuminated shelves of dusty wine bottles and crates covered in cobwebs. But in the far corner, partially hidden behind old furniture, she saw something that made her pulse quicken: a trapdoor. It was small and reinforced with iron hinges, the wood warped with age. Sophie hesitated, the warnings she'd dismissed earlier clawing at the edge of her mind. But curiosity won. She pried the door open, revealing a set of stone steps spiraling into darkness. The air grew colder as Sophie descended, the smell of earth and decay growing stronger. Her flashlight flickered, and for a terrifying moment she was plunged into darkness. She smacked it against her palm and the beam returned, revealing a cavernous room. The walls were lined with shelves, each cluttered with jars of preserved specimens, alchemical tools and handwritten ledgers. In the center of the room stood a large stone table, its surface stained with a substance she couldn't identify. Chains hung from the walls, and Sophie's breath caught when she saw deep gouges in the stone floor, as if something had struggled violently to escape. She moved to the table, her eyes scanning the inscriptions carved into it. They were symbols she didn't recognize, but the feeling they evoked was primal, wrong. As Sophie reached for one of the ledgers, she heard it, a low growl that seemed to come from all directions at once. She froze, her heart thundering in her chest. Slowly she turned, her flashlight trembling in her grip. A pair of yellow eyes stared back at her from the shadows. The creature emerged slowly, its form grotesque and unnatural. Its body was humanoid, but its limbs were elongated and bent at impossible angles. Its skin was ashen and stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Sophie backed away, but the creature moved with her, its movements jerky and inhuman. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice shaking. The creature lunged. Sophie scrambled backward, her flashlight slipping from her grasp. In the chaos, her hand found a thick metal rod and she swung it wildly. The creature let out a deafening screech as the rod connected with its head, giving her a moment to escape. She fled up the stairs, her legs burning with exertion. She could hear the creature's claws scraping against the stone, its ragged breathing growing closer. Bursting through the basement door, she slammed it shut and shoved a heavy cabinet against it. For hours, Sophie sat in the corner of her room, clutching the metal rod and waiting for the sun to rise. When morning came, she confronted Frau Meisner. "What the hell is under this inn?" Sophie demanded, her voice hoarse. Frau Meisner paled but didn't deny knowing. "You went into the basement, didn't you? You knew about this?" Sophie shouted. The old woman sighed, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not the cellar you should fear, it's what the alchemist left behind. He tried to play God to create life. And when he failed, he abandoned it. But it didn't die." Sophie left Baden that day, but the experience never left her. She tried to write about it, to warn others, but every editor rejected her story, calling it implausible. She stopped pursuing it, haunted by nightmares of yellow eyes and scraping claws. Years later, Sophie heard of an inexplicable fire that consumed the Schwartz Rose Inn. The official report said no one was inside, but Sophie knew better. Something had been destroyed, or freed. And somewhere deep in the Black Forest, the legend of Der Verlorene Keller began anew. Ryan Waters had always dreamed of making it big with his podcast. His show, Echoes of the Unsolved, focused on mysterious disappearances, paranormal events and unsolved crimes. Over 2 years he had built a small but devoted fanbase who eagerly tuned in every week. For his latest episode, however, Ryan wanted to dive into something truly obscure, something that would get people talking. He found his subject through a forum post titled, "The Vanished Voices, The Curse of Station 84. The post detailed an old pirate radio station from the 1980s called Station 84. According to legend, anyone who tuned in at midnight would hear unsettling broadcasts, static-filled music, chilling whispers, and occasionally desperate cries for help. The station had stopped transmitting decades ago, but its ghostly reputation lived on. Ryan was hooked. Ryan began his research with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. He scoured old forums, digital archives, and obscure message boards, piecing together the station's dark history. According to reports, Several people who had allegedly listened to Station 84 had gone missing shortly afterward. Others claimed to have seen unsettling shadows in their homes after tuning in. Despite the legends, Ryan struggled to find concrete proof of the station's existence. But then an email arrived in his inbox. The subject line read, "I can help you find it." The email was from someone named Spectre84. It was short. "If you want Station 84, tune your ham radio to frequency 128.7 at 12 a.m. tonight. Record everything. But be careful, what you hear can follow you." Ryan's curiosity eclipsed his better judgment. That night, Ryan set up his makeshift recording station in his home studio. He dusted off an old ham radio he'd bought years ago for a previous episode but had never used. With the frequency dialed to 128.7, he hit record on his equipment and waited. Midnight struck. At first there was only static. Then faintly he heard it, a low hum almost musical. The sound grew louder, morphing into a haunting melody interwoven with distorted voices. The whispers were faint but distinct, as though they were speaking directly into his ears. "Help me," one voice whimpered. "Turn it off," another hissed, barely audible but commanding. Ryan's heart raced, but he couldn't look away from the equipment. The static returned, punctuated by an ear-splitting screech that made him yank off his headphones. When he looked at his recording software, the audio levels were spiking erratically. The broadcast ended as suddenly as it had begun. The following morning, Ryan listened to the recording, noting every detail. The voices were clearer than he had realized in real time. One in particular caught his attention, a frantic plea. "They're coming for you?" Ryan brushed it off as a hoax or someone's idea of a prank. Still, he couldn't shake the chill that lingered after hearing the broadcast. He edited the episode, narrating his experience and including clips from the eerie recording. By the time he uploaded the podcast that evening, he felt drained but satisfied. This would be his most popular episode yet. It was. The next morning, his email was flooded with messages. "Your latest episode is chilling. Is it real? I heard whispers in my house after listening to this. Please tell me it's fake. Dude, I heard something last night that wasn't from the podcast. What did you unleash?" Ryan was used to dramatic reactions from listeners, but something felt different this time. He shrugged it off as overactive imaginations. That is, until he noticed something strange. His equipment had been tampered with. The ham radio, which he had powered down after the broadcast, was humming softly, the frequency dial stuck on 128.7. His microphone, normally still on its stand, was lying on the floor as if it had been pushed over. And then there was the shadow. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a dark figure standing in the far corner of his studio. But when he turned to face it, it was gone. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Ryan heard faint whispers at night, too soft to make out but undeniably present. Objects in his apartment seemed to move on their own, a pen rolling off his desk, a chair rocking gently. Sleep became elusive as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He replayed the recording from that night on Station 84, trying to decipher the hidden messages. The voices, now crystal clear, repeated phrases like "turn it off" and "it's too late." On the fourth night, the whispers weren't confined to his recordings. They were in his room. "Help us." Desperate for answers, Ryan emailed Spectre84, demanding an explanation. The reply was swift but cryptic. "You shouldn't have broadcasted it. The voices are anchors. They need listeners to escape. You gave them an audience. They won't stop until they're free." Panic set in as Ryan connected the dots. By sharing his podcast, he hadn't just invited the haunting into his own life. He had spread it to thousands of listeners. That night, the voices grew unbearable. They screamed, they wept, they laughed, a cacophony of torment that drove Ryan to the brink of madness. He smashed the ham radio, tore apart his recording equipment, and even tried deleting the episode. It didn't help. Ryan's podcast vanished after that, his accounts deactivated and his apartment left abandoned. Rumors circulated among fans, some claiming to have heard Ryan's voice in distorted static during midnight radio broadcasts. Others swore they saw him, emaciated, wild-eyed, wandering aimlessly on the outskirts of town. As for those who listened to his final episode, many reported hearing whispers in the dead of night, objects shifting inexplicably, and shadows that didn't belong. The lost voices of Station 84 had found new homes. Trucks were Joe's livelihood. He'd been driving rigs for over 15 years, hauling cargo across desolate highways, through endless nights lit only by the dim glow of dashboard gauges and fleeting neon signs. But there was one route that even he dreaded, Route 709, a forgotten stretch of road cutting through dense forests and marshlands. Locals called it the Shadow Haul. Rumors swirled about mysterious accidents and unexplainable disappearances. Truckers whispered tales of headlights that appeared and disappeared in the rearview mirror, shadows moving too fast for their size. Joe didn't believe in such things, until the night he took the wrong job. Joe was sitting at the Rusty Axle Diner when he got the call. A late-night delivery needed immediate attention. A shipment of sealed crates heading to a warehouse on the outskirts of Jackson. The payout was double his usual rate, and the dispatcher, a man he didn't recognize, seemed eager, desperate even, to get the job done. "It's urgent, Joe," the man's gravelly voice crackled over the line. "No stops. No questions. Just get it there before dawn." Joe agreed, brushing off the man's unease as overzealousness. Money was money and he was behind on his bills. The trailer was loaded when Joe arrived at the yard, the crates strapped down and ready. No labels, no packing slips, just a stark black tarp covering them like a shroud. As he climbed into the cab, a chill crawled up his spine. Shrugging it off, he started the engine and pulled onto the highway. The night stretched out like an ink-black ribbon. The radio crackled as Joe scanned for stations, settling on an oldies channel. The tunes were calming, drowning out the hum of the tires on the asphalt. An hour passed uneventfully, until he noticed the headlights. At first, Joe thought it was another rig following behind him. The twin beams appeared in his mirrors, steady and distant. But something felt off. The headlights seemed too high, hovering unnaturally above the road. He squinted, adjusting the mirrors for a better look. The lights blinked out. "What the hell?" he muttered, checking his blind spots. No cars, no sign of movement, just the endless forest. Minutes later the lights were back, closer this time. They flickered erratically as if the vehicle was struggling to stay in existence. Joe's hands tightened on the wheel, the chill from earlier returning with force. By the third hour, the lights were gone again, but the unease remained. Joe reached for his thermos of coffee, only to jerk back as the steering wheel vibrated violently. The truck shuddered to a halt on the shoulder, the engine gasping like it had run a marathon. "Great," Joe grumbled, stepping out with a flashlight. As he inspected the trailer and tires, he noticed something odd. The air was unnaturally still. No wind, no rustling leaves. Even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Then he saw them. Footprints. Large, uneven prints sank into the dirt by the rear wheels, leading away from the truck into the dark woods. They weren't human. Each print had elongated toes, sharp grooves in the soil like claws had gripped the earth. Joe jumped back into the cab, slamming the door and locking it. He hit the ignition, coaxing the reluctant engine back to life. The dashboard lights flickered, but the truck lurched forward. As he pulled back onto the road, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every tree swayed unnaturally as if reaching for him. And then the whispers started. Faint at first like static, they grew louder, more distinct. "Turn around. You're not supposed to be here. Stop the truck." Joe turned up the radio, but the whispers crawled under the music, seeping into his thoughts. The tension peaked when he checked the rearview mirror again. There, standing on top of the trailer, was a shadowy figure, tall, gaunt, with glowing red eyes. Joe's heart pounded as the figure began to move, climbing toward the cab with deliberate, jerking motions. He floored the gas pedal, the truck groaning in protest as it sped down the winding road. The shadow figure pressed a hand against the windshield. Its fingers left streaks of inky darkness that seemed to writhe and pulse, alive in some alien way. Joe swerved, trying to shake it off. And then it spoke. "You took what is ours." The words chilled him to his core. He slammed the brakes, hoping to dislodge the figure, but the cab spun out, skidding into the ditch. The trailer tipped, the crates crashing loudly as they spilled into the roadside. Joe scrambled out, flashlight in hand, and pointed it toward the wreckage. One crate had broken open, revealing its contents: bones. Human bones. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar. Shadows spilled out from the forest, coalescing around the broken crate, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke in a hurricane. Joe ran, his flashlight flickering as he stumbled through the woods. Behind him, the shadows pursued, their voices screaming accusations. Thief? Desecrator? You will pay. Hours later, the sun rose, revealing an empty highway. Joe's truck was gone, as were the crates and their grim contents. Authorities found no trace of the wreck, and Joe himself was never seen again. But truckers passing through Route 709 often report strange occurrences: flickering headlights, shadowy figures standing by the roadside, and an eerie whispering carried on the wind. Those brave enough to investigate say they sometimes see the ghost of a rig barreling down the highway at midnight, its driver's terrified face frozen in an eternal scream. They said the black market wasn't a place, it was an idea. A network of whispers traded over encrypted chats, hidden alleys, and unmarked warehouses. Devin wasn't sure how he'd stumbled upon it, just a string of peculiar ads popping up after hours spent combing the dark web. Items no one should be able to sell, memories of a forgotten era, regrets, bottled, and a cryptic item you can't refuse. It was the latter that caught Devin's eye. A simple link, an equally simple address: 88 Ashford Street, midnight. Payment: something precious. He was a thrill seeker. Always had been. Riding roller coasters, bungee jumping off cliffs. But this was different. It wasn't about adrenaline. It was the itch to unravel the taboo, to see what people whispered about in hushed tones. That's what brought him to the cracked facade of 88 Ashford Street, a nondescript building with no signs, not even graffiti. The air was damp and carried the faint metallic tang of rust. Devin hesitated at the door, his pulse quickening. He had no idea what payment, something precious, meant, but a small part of him wanted to find out. Inside was an overwhelming maze of sights and smells. Tables lined the walls, covered in everything from antiques to medical supplies that screamed highly illegal. Strange people milled about, hunched figures in dark hoods, elegant men and women with faces too perfect to be real, and others who looked wrong, as though they had been shaped by someone unfamiliar with human anatomy. Looking for something special? A raspy voice asked. Devin turned, startled. The man was rail-thin and draped in a heavy coat that looked like it had been patched together from a dozen mismatched fabrics. His eyes gleamed like polished onyx, unsettlingly reflective. Yeah, Devin muttered, suddenly unsure. I saw an ad. Something about an item I can't refuse? The man grinned, revealing teeth that were sharp and discolored. You're a curious one. He gestured for Devin to follow. They weaved through the bizarre marketplace until they reached a small stall hidden in a dark corner. The table bore a single item, a jet-black box no bigger than a shoebox. This, the merchant said, tapping the box with a bony finger, is exactly what you're looking for. What is it? That's for you to discover. Everyone's box is different. Unique to them. Devin frowned. It sounded like a scam, but there was something unnerving about the way the merchant stared at him, like he was peering into his soul. How much? The merchant's grin widened. I told you. Something precious. Devin hesitated, then reached for his wallet. He pulled out $500 in cash. The merchant shook his head. Not money. Precious. Something that matters. Devin thought for a moment before sliding his grandmother's locket off his neck. It wasn't valuable in the traditional sense, but it was the only thing he had left of her. The merchant snatched it eagerly, tucking it into his coat. Fair trade, he croaked, sliding the box toward Devin. As soon as the box was in his hands, Devin felt its pull, literal and figurative. It was heavy, unnaturally so for its size, and its surface seemed to pulse faintly beneath his fingertips. The moment Devin left the black market, the unease began. He noticed the shadows were thicker than usual, pooling around streetlights and lingering where they shouldn't. The box felt heavier with every step. By the time he reached his apartment, his chest was tight with anxiety. But curiosity burned brighter. He sat at his kitchen table, turned on every light in the room and examined the box. It had no seams, no hinges, just that smooth, inky surface. He ran his fingers over it, searching for an opening. As his palm brushed the top, the box hissed softly and a crack appeared. Inside was a photograph. It was a picture of Devin sitting at his kitchen table, this kitchen table. Same angle, same lighting. But the background was wrong. The shadows on the walls seemed alive, swirling and writhing. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the photo showed him looking at another photo inside the box. He reached in again and pulled out a second photo. This one was from behind him. A dark figure loomed in the corner of the room, featureless except for glowing eyes. Devin spun around, heart hammering. Nothing was there. The third photo showed him holding the box, his expression twisted in terror as the shadow figure loomed closer. His hands trembled as he reached for the next photo, pulling it free. This time the shadow wasn't in the picture. It was behind him. The hairs on his neck stood on end as he felt the air grow colder. Slowly he turned, his breath shallow. The shadowy figure from the photo was there, its glowing eyes fixed on him. "What do you want?" Devin croaked, backing away. It didn't respond. Instead, it pointed at the box. Devin hesitated, then picked the box back up. It was lighter now, its surface warmer to the touch. The figure dissolved into the shadows as he opened it again. Inside was another photo, but this time it wasn't him. It was his grandmother. She was sitting in her rocking chair, her face frozen in a mixture of confusion and fear. "No," Devin whispered. A muffled noise came from the box, faint but unmistakable, a woman's voice calling his name. Desperate, Devin grabbed his phone and called the number for the merchant. It rang endlessly before going to voicemail. He yelled into the receiver, demanding answers, but there was no response. Over the next few days things only got worse. Devin couldn't sleep, haunted by nightmares of the shadowy figure dragging him into darkness. More photos appeared inside the box every night, each showing loved ones in increasingly horrifying scenarios. His best friend screaming silently, his mother standing motionless in a dimly lit room, tears streaming down her face. He tried throwing the box away, even burning it. But each time, it reappeared on his kitchen table, pristine and waiting. By the seventh day, Devin was at his wits' end. The last photo was of himself again, but his face was gone, a blank slate of skin. That night he vanished. When authorities searched Devin's apartment, all they found was the black box sitting on the kitchen table, untouched. Every officer who handled it swore they heard faint whispers coming from inside. The box disappeared from evidence storage 2 days later. Rumor has it it's back on the black market, waiting for its next buyer. And so, the merchant of shadows waits. Always waiting for someone curious and desperate enough to pay the ultimate price. It was a chilly Thursday night when Dylan found the flyer. It had been shoved under the windshield wiper of his old sedan, just another piece of junk littering the parking lot of his apartment building. The flyer was printed on thick black paper with white, almost handwritten lettering. One night only, a cinema experience unlike any other. Midnight showing at the Eclipse Theater. Admission free. Underneath was a simple address and nothing else. Dylan frowned. The Eclipse Theater? He'd lived in this city his whole life, but he'd never heard of it. The flyer was weird enough to pique his interest. He didn't have anything better to do and midnight was still hours away. By 11:30, curiosity got the better of him. The Eclipse Theater sat on the outskirts of the city, tucked away in an industrial district where old factories loomed like sleeping giants. It was surprisingly small, with a neon marquee that spelled out just 2 words, "Midnight Show." Dylan parked his car in the near-empty lot. There were only 3 other vehicles there, 2 older sedans and a van that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. The ticket booth was empty, but the door was unlocked. A faintly sweet, musty scent greeted him as he entered, like a mix of popcorn and something rotten. Inside it was like stepping into a time capsule. The Eclipse Theater was vintage, with plush red carpeting that muffled his footsteps and brass fixtures glinting under dim yellowed lights. The concession stand looked dusty, and the soda machine let out intermittent gurgles. There was no staff in sight. Just a handwritten sign above the counter. Snacks complimentary. Take what you want. Dylan grabbed a bag of popcorn, sealed, thank God, and a drink before heading into the single screening room. The theater itself was larger than he'd expected, but the screen was small, almost absurdly so given the size of the room. Faded red curtains framed it on either side, and only a few rows of plush high-backed seats occupied the space. 4 other people were already seated, each one spread out, almost deliberately distant from one another. There was an older couple near the front, a teenage boy a few rows back, and a man with a bowler hat seated dead center. As Dylan chose a seat near the aisle, the house lights dimmed. He glanced at his phone. 12 a.m. sharp. The movie began immediately, no trailers, no announcements. At first the film seemed ordinary. It was black and white, grainy with no opening credits. The scene was simple, a static shot of a room with no people, just a single chair in the center under a harsh spotlight. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Dylan shifted in his seat, already questioning his decision to come. Then, out of nowhere, a figure walked into the frame. A woman, dressed in what looked like an old maid's uniform, carrying a tray. She placed it on the chair and turned to stare directly at the camera. Her face, it was too clear, like she was staring through the screen at him. The theater seemed to grow colder. Over the next 20 minutes, the film followed the same pattern. A man entered the room next, dressed like a soldier. Then a young girl, skipping rope. They moved methodically, always placing something on the chair, a cup, a book, a cracked doll, and then they'd stop to stare at the screen. Dylan couldn't explain it, but their stares made his skin crawl. It was like they could see him sitting there, like they were aware of the audience in a way no actors ever should be. The couple in the front row whispered to each other, clearly uneasy. The man in the bowler hat sat as still as a statue, while the teenager kept nervously glancing behind him. The film continued. The people kept coming. A butcher dragging a heavy cleaver. A pale child with sunken cheeks. Their movements seemed slower now, more deliberate, and the objects they placed on the chair grew stranger, blood-stained rags, rusted tools, bones. Dylan's stomach churned. It didn't feel like a film anymore. It felt like a ritual. Then the screen flickered. For the first time, the perspective shifted, from the static shot of the room to a shot of the audience. Dylan froze. The grainy image on the screen showed the exact layout of the theater. His theater. The same seats, the same people. Himself included. Everyone else noticed too. The teenage boy gasped. The couple near the front stood up, visibly trembling. Is this some kind of prank? The man in the bowler hat asked, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. No one answered. On screen, the figure of the maid reappeared, holding a silver tray. This time, instead of placing the tray on the chair, she walked out of the room. Moments later, the theater door creaked open. Dylan's heart stopped. Slowly he turned to look. The maid was standing in the entrance, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She carried the same silver tray, her movements mirroring those on the screen. She took a step forward. The teenage boy screamed and bolted for the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic erupted. The older couple shouted, pounding on the walls. The bowler hat man stood up but didn't move. Dylan wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. On the screen the room began to change. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowered, and the spotlight on the chair grew dimmer. Figures began appearing in the shadows, watching silently. In the theater, the maid moved closer, her steps deliberate, her gaze unbroken. She stopped at the center of the aisle and placed the tray on the floor. It was empty. The lights in the theater flickered. When they stabilized, the screen showed only static. The maid was gone. So was the teenage boy. His seat sat empty, his popcorn spilled on the floor. The older couple shouted his name, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. Dylan's breath quickened. He stood, his eyes darting between the empty seat and the screen. The static shifted, forming an image. The boy, sitting in the same room from earlier, frozen like a mannequin. The bowler hat man bolted next, shoving past Dylan and sprinting toward the emergency exit. It too was locked. One by one, the lights in the theater began to fail, each bulb going out with a sharp pop. By the time the last light died, only the glow of the screen illuminated the room. On the screen, the audience was still visible. But now one more figure had joined them. Sitting in the back row, face obscured by shadows, was the teenage boy. And beside him, empty chairs began to fill, one by one, with the figures from the film. The maid. The soldier. The butcher. The last thing Dylan saw was his own reflection staring back at him from the screen. Then darkness swallowed everything. The next morning, the Eclipse Theater was gone. The building stood vacant, its doors padlocked, its windows dusty and cracked. No records of a screening existed. No flyer could be found. But occasionally, people swore they saw faint lights flickering inside at midnight, just long enough to make you wonder if the shadows watching from the windows were real. The brochures called the Bahamas a tropical paradise, clear waters, white sand beaches, and endless sun. Grace, Marco, and Lena had been saving for their trip for months, dreaming of the perfect vacation to escape the gray monotony of city life. When they finally landed on the island, everything seemed as magical as they'd imagined. They had chosen a less touristy island on purpose, one where the beaches were supposed to be untouched and the locals friendly. The ferry had dropped them off that afternoon, with the promise of pristine sands and calm waters just a short walk from the quaint village. But the brochure hadn't mentioned the eerie silence. It wasn't just the kind of peace you expect from a remote beach, it was too quiet. No birds sang. No waves crashed. Even the rustling of palm leaves in the breeze seemed muted. The group chalked it up to island charm at first, convincing themselves that this was the perfect quiet city dwellers only dreamed about. Their rented bungalow was a small but comfortable cabin tucked just beyond a stretch of trees. That first night, after a barbecue on the beach and a round of rum cocktails, Marco suggested they explore more of the island the next day. Grace hesitated. It's weird how empty it feels here though, right? Like where are all the other people? Even the shopkeepers barely said anything when we arrived. They're probably just laid back, Marco said, brushing it off. That's how it's supposed to be in paradise, right? No stress, no rush. But Lena wasn't convinced. Maybe. It's just, I don't know, it feels off. Did you see how everyone at the dock avoided eye contact? Like they were afraid of something. Afraid of what? Marco teased. Grace's terrible sunscreen game? Everyone laughed and the mood lightened. By midnight, they were all asleep, dreaming of clear waters and adventure. The next day, they decided to hike a trail leading to a cliffside view of the ocean. A small wooden signpost marked the entrance, Bliss Point Trail. Halfway up the path, Grace stopped suddenly. Do you guys smell that? Marco sniffed the air. It was faint but distinct, a sickly sweet odor that didn't belong in the tropical setting. Like rotting fruit but heavier. Probably a dead animal or something, Marco said, though his tone was less confident now. The three exchanged uneasy glances but continued on. At the top of the trail, the view was breathtaking. The ocean stretched endlessly, its surface like liquid glass reflecting the sun. But that oppressive silence lingered, and now it felt heavier, pressing against their ears like cotton. Lena's phone buzzed, breaking the tension. She glanced at the screen and frowned. No service, but I just got a notification? What does it say? Grace asked, leaning over. Lena read it aloud, her voice shaking slightly. Do not stay past sundown. The group laughed nervously, assuming it was some weird glitch or a prank. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the air seemed to grow colder, and the trail back down felt steeper than before. By the time they reached the bungalow, the sky was painted in shades of red and orange, casting long shadows across the beach. Grace turned to look at the ocean. There's someone standing in the water, she whispered. Marco squinted. Sure enough, a figure stood knee-deep in the surf, facing away from them. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the growing wind that swept across the beach. Maybe they're fishing, Lena offered weakly. With no gear? Marco muttered. The figure stepped forward, into the water, not out of it, and disappeared beneath the surface. The wind picked up as night fell, howling through the trees around their bungalow. They tried to settle in, convincing themselves it was just their imaginations running wild, but sleep didn't come easily. At some point in the night, Marco woke to the sound of soft tapping. He froze, listening. It wasn't coming from the front door or the windows. It sounded like it was coming from inside the house. He nudged Grace awake. "Do you hear that?" The tapping grew louder, like wet feet slapping against the wooden floor. Grace's eyes widened. "Lena?" Marco called, his voice shaking. No response. They crept to Lena's room, but the bed was empty, the sheets tossed aside. The window was open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. Then they heard it, a low, gurgling sound almost like laughter coming from the beach. Grabbing a flashlight, they ran outside, the beam cutting through the thick darkness. The beach was empty except for footprints in the sand leading toward the water. "Lena?" Grace called, her voice cracking. A splash came from the shoreline. When they turned the flashlight toward the ocean, they saw her. She stood knee-deep in the water, facing away from them, just like the figure they'd seen earlier. "Lena?" Marco yelled, starting toward her. Grace grabbed his arm. "Wait, something's wrong?" As if on cue, Lena turned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Behind her, dozens of other figures began to rise from the water, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Grace screamed, pulling Marco back toward the bungalow. The figures didn't chase them, but their presence felt suffocating, the silence more deafening than ever. Barricading themselves inside the bungalow, Marco and Grace tried to call for help, but the phones were dead, and the Wi-Fi was non-existent. All they could do was wait, the sound of footsteps circling the house growing louder as the night stretched on. By morning, the footprints on the beach were gone. The ocean was calm, and Lena was nowhere to be found. The ferry arrived later that day to take them back to the main island. They didn't tell the captain what had happened. They didn't need to. "You should have listened to the warnings," he said, his voice quiet but stern. "People disappear on that island for a reason. The locals don't speak of it, but we know. The shore is cursed. The ocean takes what it wants." Marco and Grace didn't respond. They stared at the water as the ferry pulled away, half expecting to see Lena's face beneath the waves. They never returned to the Bahamas. Years later, Marco received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of a beach. In the background, partially obscured by the waves, he thought he saw Lena, smiling faintly. And on the back, written in shaky handwriting, were 3 words: "Do not return."